Hey, welcome to this week's Sunday Sit Down. I am Jamey Stegmeyer. I run Stonemaier Games, and today I'm going to talk about campaign games. So I'm going to try to define them, at least in terms of my definition. Then I will list the 7 campaign games that I've completed from start to finish, and I'll rank them. And then I'll talk about campaign games from a design perspective and a publishing perspective as well, because there's a lot of little things that I found that I want from a campaign game, and a lot of things that I don't want from a campaign game. This video is definitely not meant to be negative, but I am going to mention both positive and negative examples of the things that I'll talk about today in the design discussion. So first, let me define what I consider a campaign game to be. I consider a campaign tabletop game to be one that features persistence in a specific order, or where order matters, with no permanence. And so I'm using those words carefully, though. Oh, and also with a clear beginning and clear end. So there's a lot going on there. So persistence is things that carry over from game to game. The things you do in one game can impact your future games. Maybe your character gets stronger, or if you play scenario 1, then depending on what happens in that scenario, you may need to play a certain other scenario next. So like order matters there a little bit. But no permanence. So a legacy game, many of which are also campaign games. A legacy game is one that features permanence. While many legacy games are campaign games, they aren't. All campaign games are not legacy games, because a lot of campaign games do not feature permanence. You can completely reset it, and they're not designed to feature permanence in the way a legacy game is. I also want to differentiate this from a scenario game, including one that was right on the border was Seventh Continent. A more obvious example is Mansions of Madness. Those are games where you can play the scenarios. There are lots of different scenarios, and you can play them in any order. Time stories would be another example there, where even though there's kind of like overarching things that you might learn about the world by playing these different scenarios, you can play them in any order. You don't need to have played one scenario to play another one. Seventh Continent is kind of a weird thing, because in Seventh Continent, a scenario might last 20 hours. And so it feels like a little mini campaign, a self-enclosed campaign. And I think you could totally argue that that is the case, that when you play a scenario in Seventh Continent, that is a campaign in itself. And so I could totally see that argument if you want to argue that. And the last element is that it has a clear beginning and end. And this knocked off a few games that I instinctively thought of as campaign games. But when I thought about it, a campaign I see as having somewhat of a narrative arc or a journey, a start and a finish. And there are a few games that didn't quite meet that condition. One that was originally on the list was Arkham Horror Lcg, which I've only played one game of. And so I think like Seventh Continent, it does have little mini story arcs that are self-enclosed campaigns. But from a bit of an outsider's perspective, I see it as having all these different modules that you can mix and match. But you will probably tell me that that's wrong, because I think there is little mini campaigns in that one. I just don't know enough about it. Imperial Assault is another one where I've only played one game of Imperial Assault. And there was persistence, there was an order to the story, but there wasn't really a clear beginning or an end. We were just going to play for a while, and I'm guessing that's how most people play Imperial Assault. They just play different scenarios for a while. Maybe the order matters, but there isn't a clear end goal in sight. And the other one was Gloomhaven, which originally instinctively was the first game on my list as a clear campaign game, because you are playing an ongoing story with persistence. But Gloomhaven, it has so many scenarios. When I played it, I didn't get the clear impression that there was a clear end to it. There wasn't a clear goal that we were working towards. There were little mini goals, like it was almost like campaigns were built into the game for Gloomhaven, where like you're trying to reach your character's lifetime goal, and so that was your own individual campaign, which is a cool concept to play, but I didn't get the impression that I was sitting down to play Gloomhaven, and then after a certain amount of time, a certain number of episodes, a certain number of things that would happen, I didn't get the impression that it would be over at a certain point when we killed the final dragon or rescued the land from blight or something like that. But again, it's been a couple of years since I played Gloomhaven, so maybe there is a clear end goal in the campaign that I'm forgetting about. So feel free to confirm or deny any of the things that I just said, but that is my definition. A game with persistence, but not permanence, that has scenarios that have a specific order to them and a clear beginning and a clear end. I will mention my top 7. Well, okay, so there's 7 campaign games that I did not design or publish that I have played from start to finish. And I will end up talking about these games more in detail in the design discussion that will come in this video. So right now I'm just going to rank them and show you how I feel about them. And I want to say, even before I said the number 7, because this is a great list of games. I really, really love the narrative arcs featured by campaign games. I love the persistence. I love the differentiation in the different stories. So the bottom game on this list is still a great game. It just happens to be my least favorite of these campaign games that I have finished. So even that in itself is saying a lot, that I've taken the time to finish these campaigns. And so it's really a high list. And so with that caveat ended, actually I don't have it here because I have the other one. Pandemic Legacy Season 1 is my number 7. Pandemic Legacy Season 2 is my number 6. Spy Club is my number 5. My number 4 is Mechs versus Minions, which is on my shelf back there, but it's so big that it's just tough to lug around. So that's Mechs versus Minions is my number 4. My number 3 is Near and Far, which I no longer own because I finished the campaign, even though you can play it without the campaign. That's Near and Far. And my number 2, also don't have because it's at my friend's house. That's Aeon's End Legacy. And my number 1 is also my number 1 game of 2018, and that is The Rise of Queensdale. All right. I will talk about those games in detail in the design discussion. So I'm going to talk about a lot of things here that I look for in a campaign game. Now that I've designed 2 of them, I've designed Charterstone and I've designed the Rise of Fenris expansion for Scythe, co-designed it. And so I've learned a lot about, and I played all these campaign games, and I played some campaign games that I haven't gotten very far in at all. And so I've learned a lot about what I like, what I don't like, what I'm looking for. And so this is just my opinion, but these are things that I would recommend that you at least think about if you're going to design a campaign game. This is in no particular order. So the first thing on my list that I wrote down was that each episode is different, but also a little bit the same. So the thinking there is, and I'll talk about rules overhead in a separate category here in a minute. But the idea is the same part of this is that you don't want players to have to completely relearn the game every time they play. It's really helpful to have a core gameplay that players are comfortable with, and then they can branch outside of it each scenario or as the game evolves over the course of the campaign. But I think it's also key that the games feel different enough that you don't feel like you're playing the same thing over and over again. And one example of this that I think that did this really, really well is Near and Far. I think Near and Far has a great core gameplay. That's another category I'll mention in a minute. Great core gameplay that's easy to understand, easy to remember. But each scenario, you get to open, you have this big map book, and every scenario in it, you turn the page of the map and you have a completely new map. So you're not playing on the same map every game. You're playing on a completely different map of the world. So you really feel like you're moving elsewhere. You're moving forward in the world, and you have this new world explored. The act of turning that page to the new map is a wonderful moment of discovery, another category that I'll mention later on. But I think Near and Far did this really well. It had a great core gameplay, but each scenario felt distinctly different. And many of these other games did the same thing in different ways. Yeah, I'll mention other examples as I go. But Spy Club was another one that did this really well, where Spy Club has a great core gameplay, but each scenario has its own distinct twist on the game mechanisms. I tried to do this with Charterstone. Mechs versus Minions had a little different rules in each scenario. But yeah, so that's I think a key element. In a campaign game, I really want, this is number 2, I want distinct, memorable moments. Designed by the campaign. So I want certain things that when I look back on the campaign experience, not only am I able to tell my own story about the journey that I went on in that campaign, but I also want a few specific things that I can look back on and say, oh, I remember that happening. That was amazing. That was terrifying. That was good. That was bad. However I feel about it, I want it to be memorable. And so that was something big that I focused on with Charterstone and the Rise of Fenris. There are certain moments in both of those campaigns that are designed to be memorable moments, whether or not they make players happy. So I kind of put the players' happiness aside at times to make memorable moments in those games. I think Pandemic Legacy Season 1 did this really well. There are a few moments in Pandemic Legacy Season 1 that everyone can talk about who has played that campaign. We kind of share those moments, even though they may have happened in slightly different ways. But they're very memorable, very distinct moments in those campaigns that happen, whether they're reveals or bad things that happen. Whereas with some of these other campaign games, I don't necessarily know if I have that. Rise of Queensdale, wonderful, wonderful game. Obviously my number one campaign game that I played all the way through. And there are little moments, most of them generated by the stories my friends and I told as we played. But I wouldn't say, looking back at it, that there are these huge memorable moments in the campaign. It's more like new clever mechanisms that impacted the way that we played. Okay, so another category is that more isn't better. And this is a big one. When I was originally designing Charterstone, I went into it thinking that more was better. That I originally had 20 different episodes. It was a 20-episode game. And I think the reason for this is that as designers, and you may have seen this, when people talk about campaign games, they often talk about them in almost a derogatory way, because they see it as a limited play experience where you only get to play 8 games or 12 games or 15 games. And I think that got in my head as a designer, and I've seen that get in other designers' heads, where we're trying to cater to people who want the experience that every other game, every non-campaign game offers, which is unlimited play. But the problem is that I think the story can really suffer if you do that. And I think the longer the campaign, the less of a chance you have that people will actually finish the campaign. And I think the less of the chance that you'll have that people will actually even start it or buy it in the first place. I'm sure there's still a minority of people who just either will never buy a campaign game, or they'll only buy a campaign game if it has 100 scenarios like Gloomhaven does. I totally get that. But I think the vast majority of people want a game that they actually know that they can play and finish if it's a campaign game with a clear start and finish, like I mentioned in my description. And so I really want to applaud Spy Club for having a 5-game campaign, but by having so many different scenarios that link together that you really could, if you love Spy Club, you could play probably at least a dozen unique campaigns of Spy Club, and have a unique experience every time, because there's so many different scenarios that still link together. 5-game campaign arc in Spy Club, which I think is brilliant. And I'll come back to this in a second in terms of 5 games, but when I say 5 games, I mean 5 games, 5 sessions of Spy Club, and you are done with the campaign. I think that was brilliant. I think that was a brilliant move. Rise of Fenris is 8 games. I think that's probably... 8 is probably the max that I'd want to play for a campaign game now. I think that's right at the max. Aeon's End Legacy, 7 games advertised on the box. 7-game campaign I think is great. But any longer than that, even Charterstone ended up being, 12 games? 12 games. I kind of wish, looking back, that it had just been 10. Because 12, I think, is a little long. So think about that. More is not better, in my opinion, for campaign games. The narrative. I think the narrative is so important in a campaign game. This is one of the great things that a campaign game can bring to the table. That you have this narrative arc, a clear start, a clear finish, that you get to tell these stories from then on. It ties into the memorable moments as well. In Fenris, this was a huge thing that we did with the Rise of Fenris. The narrative really drove the story. Or drove the mechanisms of the game. Ryan, my co-designer, wrote a lot of the narrative, so a lot of it is actual written narrative, written lore in the game. And in it we had a long paragraphs that you could read in each scenario, each episode, that had a lot of details. And we also had a condensed version because we wanted to make sure if people didn't want to read a lot, they could just read like 2 sentences and get the narrative for that game and how it evolved over episode to episode. I think I'll talk about this a little bit more with how the story can either branch or be linear. But I think Pandemic Legacy Season 1 did a great job with the narrative because it was linear. They were able to tell the story they wanted to tell, and you kind of existed within that story, almost like you were watching a TV show and maybe choosing a few little things along the way. But I think by having a linear story, they were able to tell a very strong narrative in that game. Yeah, I think those are some of the best examples so far. Okay, and here that branches right into the next category, which is that I think players need to have an impact on the story in a campaign game. I think this is really, really important, that the decisions that I make and the things that happen in episode 2 impact the things that happen in episode 3, or maybe some far-reaching episode, maybe something much later down in the game, down in the campaign. Aeon's End has done this really well. There's a lot of interesting decisions that we've made early on in the Aeon's End campaign that have impacted us later on in the campaign, or come back to bite us, or come back not to bite us because of the decisions we made early on. Spy Club does this really well, because in Spy Club, the outcome of each episode impacts what the next episode will be. And not whether or not you win or lose, but it has to do with like where a certain card ends up in a certain place at the end of the game. That card impacts what the next scenario will be. Like an idea off the top of my head to give an example of this is that at the end of the game, if the ice cream card meant something, then the next game might actually be ice cream themed, which I think is really, really cool that Spy Club did that. And it has so many different scenarios depending on that one single card at the end of the campaign. This is an area where Pandemic Legacy Season 1 and Season 2 diverged in a really interesting way. In Season 1, it is a linear story that just happens, and you like I said, you kind of you exist within that storyline, and the things that happen might vary a little bit depending on your specific scenario, or the way that you've played the game, but you're kind of just you're following the story of Pandemic Legacy Season 1, and that was actually one of my complaints about Season 1. And so I really like that in Season 2, the story goes in many different directions. You kind of direct which way the story is going to go, because you start off with a pretty much a blank map in the world. And so you kind of just decide which area of the world that you want to unveil in which order. And there's some other things, too, that I don't want to spoil. But I think there's a pro and a con to that. I like that players have a huge impact on the story in Pandemic Legacy Season 2, but it also ended up being a less memorable story because the designers weren't able to build in those memorable moments, those key plot points when they happened. Although there still is a pretty memorable key plot point in Pandemic Legacy Season 2 that I really enjoyed. Another category is that I think in a campaign game, you need to give players the ability to improve and evolve every game. And by that, I mean, I literally mean every game. I think at the end of the game, and even during the game, I think you should have the ability to get better and have that carry over to the next game. And I think there are a few legacy games and campaign games that do this too slowly, where they don't give players that immediate positive feedback at the end of every game. And one example of that is Dragonfire. I played a game of Dragonfire. It was a solid game. But like at the end of the game, I was maybe 1/5 of the way towards making my character better. I don't think that's a good move. I think you want to be able to make your character immediately better. I think this is another instance of a designer trying to stretch out a campaign, to something more substantial to meet what they think players want. But what I really want as a player is to feel like I've improved after every game, in every game. I had another category related to that. I'll have to come back to it. I'll have to come back to that. The next category is that, and this is going to be a long video, by the way. We're going to be here for another 10 minutes. The next is the core gameplay must be good. So I talked about this a little bit with the near and far example, that each episode must be the same but different. And near and far is a good example of a game where the core gameplay itself I thought was really, really interesting, really solid. It was enhanced by the story, by the different maps, all that stuff. But I think the core gameplay was solid. Another example is the Rise of Queensdale. I genuinely enjoyed the core gameplay of the Rise of Queensdale. I think they did some really interesting things with the core gameplay. A bad example, unfortunately, is Seafall. I do not think Seafall's core gameplay was very good. I think in Seafall, players only get like 6 or 7 turns the entire game. Turns can last a while. Your turn and your game can end based on a bad die roll. I don't think the core gameplay of Seafall was very good, and I think it significantly suffered as a result of that. That was an example where we wanted to discover more. We wanted to continue the campaign, but we didn't want to continue to actually play the game itself. So I highly recommend that you make sure your core gameplay is interesting and fun and compelling for players. Okay, next category is that you ramp up the complexity while keeping the rules overhead to a minimum. And I think there are a few different ways to do this. One great example of this, I think, is the Harry Potter Hogwarts battle. It's a 7-game campaign where you start off with a very, very simple deck building game. It plays really, really fast. You play through that, and then you add a rule. You unlock something, you add a rule, and you play Episode 2. And Episode 2 is the same, but it adds a little bit more complexity, and the same with Episode 3. Risk Legacy did something similar. The first game of Risk Legacy is essentially a game of Risk. So if you know how to play Risk, there really isn't much to learn in that first game. And then you play game 2 and you add on to that rule. I'm mentioning these 2 examples because Risk is an existing game that you're building the campaign off of. In Harry Potter, it's a new game, and they introduce kind of very simple, streamlined game mechanisms in the first game and ramp up from there. And so I think that's one approach, that you start simple and ramp up from there. The other approach, I think, is similar to what we did with the Rise of Fenris, which is that, and Spy Club does this too, that each scenario has its own new rules that you add, but you're not actually changing anything permanently. So you only have to learn like 1 or 2 new rules for that specific game, and then you don't have to remember them anymore. So you're not constantly adding new rules that you need to remember. And I think the key here is that, and I think as designers, I think we forget about this sometimes because we fall in love with our own games. When people play campaign games, they play them on their schedules. In my group, when we commit to a campaign game, we usually play it once a week until we're done. But some people only play campaign games, the same campaign, once every month or once every few months. And so if they have to feel like they're relearning the game every time they play, that's a big problem. So I think keep that in mind. Keep in mind that a decent percentage of people who are playing your campaign game are going to be sitting down to it after months of not playing it. And so you kind of have to construct the game with that in mind, that the people are going to come to it with having forgotten a lot about the game and the previous experience of playing the campaign. Let's see. So an example, I mentioned that one of the categories. Oh, okay. So I did clear beginning, clear end. I also think a campaign game should have clear short and long-term objectives. So within each scenario and across the entire campaign. Clarity, I think, is really, really key. And this is actually something, if I want to call Seventh Continent a campaign game, which I think arguably could be called one. It's on my shelf back there, but I didn't bring it out. In Seventh Continent, you don't know your objective going into the scenario, which is a really interesting design choice, but I didn't like it. I wanted to know what the curse meant that we were trying to find. I wanted clarity on the end goal of the campaign. That would have helped a lot. I think Gloomhaven does this well. Gloomhaven gives players very clear short-term objectives, not just for the scenario itself, but for each player. Gloomhaven is actually really good at this, having different goals. So each player gets their own individual random goal for that scenario that they're trying to accomplish. Players collectively have a goal each scenario, usually kill all the monsters. And then each player has their lifetime goal for their character that's going to be spread over multiple games of Gloomhaven. The one place where Gloomhaven suffers is that the overall campaign goal. I didn't feel like it had a clear end or a clear goal to the overall campaign. But otherwise, all those other goals, I think Gloomhaven did really, really well. This is a big one, and this is actually one of the reasons I'm filming this video. And this is a thing that I think a lot of campaign games suffer from. And it's two things tied together. I'll actually say the first one first, which is I don't want to ever play the same scenario twice in a campaign. I'm looking at you, Aeon Legacy. I'm looking at you, Pandemic Legacy Season 2, and I'm hoping that other designers don't look at those games as good examples of this thing in particular. I think it is a huge design mistake to make players play the exact same campaign, the exact same scenario twice. Gloomhaven does this too. Don't do it. Don't ask players to do that. It's especially if you're playing a 12-game campaign that can become a 24-game campaign if you lose. It's not a good idea at all. Here are better ways to do it. Here's one way. One is to have players only play one campaign, one scenario once. Obviously, that's the correction. And have the result mean something. If I lose, have that mean something for me as a player. Maybe I get a little bolster, I get something better. But also have it mean something in terms of the story. Have something bad happen in terms of the story. That's okay. That's what games are for. Bad stuff can happen, and we can continue into that bad stuff and deal with it. The other thing, and Spy Club actually does this really well. In Spy Club, as I mentioned, it's exactly 5 games because win or lose, you continue to the next game. And your win or loss matters, but you still get to continue to the next game. You're not sitting there doing the same thing twice. I think that's... actually, the one game that didn't bother me all that much with this was Mechs versus Minions, which does make you replay the games, if I'm remembering it correctly. It's been a few years. But I'm pretty sure it does make you replay the games. But the reason I'm not all that bothered by it in Mechs versus Minions is that when you lose a game of Mechs versus Minions, you lose it quickly, very quickly. You're not playing through a whole game and then playing through that entire game, hour and a half again, and win or lose. I highly recommend to designers that you do not make players play the same scenario twice. And this delves into my other comment, which is about the length of the campaign being a certain number, which actually isn't that big of a deal, because the Rise of Queensdale, it's not like you don't know how many games of Rise of Queensdale you'd be playing because of the way they did their advancement system, which is really clever. The key here, in my opinion, is that you know when you're going into the final game of the campaign. And this is another place where I think a lot of these campaign games suffer. Pandemic Legacy kind of does it okay because you know when you're going into episode 12, it's either going to be 1 or 2 games, but you know it's going to be the final game. Queensdale, we didn't know. We sat down to play the final game of Queensdale, and it ended up being a 3-game scenario or a 3-game situation because of the way that different people won or lost. And then the Legacy. I don't want to spoil anything, but it suffers from this problem in that we sat down thinking we were going into the final game, and it wasn't the final game. I think this is a problem. I really, and the reason I think this is a problem, the example I gave is imagine in a few months, you go see the Avengers Infinity War Part 2, thinking that it is the final Avengers Infinity War movie. And at the end of the movie, there's a cliffhanger, and you find out there's another movie that's going to come out 6 months later. While I might be excited to have another Avengers movie, that build-up, that preparation, the psychology behind sitting down thinking that you're watching or playing the final thing, and then find out that you're not actually doing it, that you still have more games to play, I think is a huge problem. So I would highly suggest to designers for campaign games that if you are going to have a clear start and a clear end, be clear when players are going into that final game so that they know that this is it. This is the one. This is the one that they should cook a big meal. They should set aside 3 hours. They should psychologically prepare themselves for the finale. I think that's huge. I think that's so important, and I'm kind of surprised that all these games are not doing that. Okay, let's get back to a positive. That's a long rant there. Surprises and discovery, I think. These tied to those memorable moments I mentioned before, but I love the element of campaign games and the narrative that they can add when they lead to surprises and discovery, when they're built around surprises and discovery. 2 examples. One, Mechs versus Minions. I think Mechs versus Minions does this really well because when you open a box of Mechs versus Minions, there is a big box inside that box that has something big inside, and you don't know what it is, and you don't know exactly when it's going to come out. And then at a certain point in the campaign, it does. I love that it hints. It's not like hiding it in the box. It's very clear that that thing is there, but you don't know what it is, and you don't know what it's going to do to you. And so you kind of dread it, and you wonder about it, and you're curious about it, and then finally you get to open it. Risk Legacy also used surprises and discovery as a goal, as something for players to strive for. Because in Risk Legacy, it has a lot of these different things that say, like, okay, when this happens, when one player controls 12 territories, open this package. And so it gives players these goals. I mentioned before that having short-term and long-term goals. It gives player a goal that they can follow if they want to, so that they know they're getting that surprise. They know that there's going to be a surprise. They just don't know what it is. They know they're going to discover something new, and they have control over when they discover it. I think that's really, really cool. I think persistence, I mentioned persistence is such a core thing here, that your character evolves and gets better, that the story evolves and changes, that the core mechanisms of the game change over time a little bit. Maybe you add new cards, you take some away. I think Aeon's End does this really well, because I think designing persistence is very difficult. You don't want players to get so powerful in game 1 that episodes 2 through 5 are just super easy for them. You also don't want the world to change so much that it's unrecognizable, or that players feel like they didn't have control over it. But Aeon's End Legacy, I think, does this really well. There's the character build-up, where your character itself is getting better at a pace designated by the game, and also the core gameplay itself. You're putting stickers on some cards in Aeon's End Legacy, and you're also swapping out. It's a deck building game, so you have like 10 cards out on the table. You're swapping out some of those cards and putting in new cards over the course of the campaign. I think that's a really elegant way to do a legacy or a campaign deck building game. And last, I would say, while there are exceptions to this, I think it's important to manage expectations in a campaign game. In that, if you advertise the game as a competitive scythe campaign, say that's what we did for the Rise of Fenris, that the Rise of Fenris is a campaign version of Scythe, that episode 3 shouldn't be a dexterity cooperative game. It shouldn't be a completely different game, basically. And so even though you want each episode to feel unique and memorable and special and different, I think there is a boundary that you don't want to go outside and change the game so much that players feel like, hey, I signed up for this game, but instead I got this totally different game that I wasn't expecting. So I think it's important to manage those expectations as you're designing these different scenarios. I think that's all the categories I was going to mention. There is one last thing in relation to the open world game that I'm designing, which is not a campaign game. But I have been thinking a lot about it in terms of persistence and how much players should carry over from game to game, basically. Because I think that's a key design decision point. How much do you let players evolve from game to game so that, like I said, that they don't get so powerful that game 2 isn't memorable or game 2 isn't meaningful because they're so powerful there. So I'm trying to strike that right balance right now in my open world cooperative game. How much players can carry over and still feel like it thematically makes sense that they had this thing on day 1 and now they do or don't have that thing on game 2. So I'm trying to strike that balance. I'm curious what you think about games that let you carry over some stuff and not other stuff. Does it make sense thematically? Have the games that you've played, have they made sense thematically in that way, or have they not? This might be the longest video yet. This is right at 34 minutes right now. I would love to hear your thoughts on these various topics that I've covered today. Do you think, is your definition of a campaign game the same as mine? Are the things that I mentioned as being important for campaign games or important considerations, are they important to you? And what are a few of your favorite campaign games, and why do you love them as campaign games? I'd love to hear your thoughts in your comments. I will talk to you there. All right, take care. Bye.